evening, everybody. Welcome to Freedom School. My name is Leah T. Bascom, and I'm Associate Professor in the Department of African American Studies. I would like to thank our partners this evening, Auburn Avenue Research Library, and my colleague, Dr. Lakita Bennett Bailey, for organizing the series. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome our speaker this evening. The title of her talk is Restorative Economics, How Do We Transition to a More Just Economy? And her name is Ms. Nwamaka Agbo. Nwamaka Agbo is a restorative economics practitioner with a background in organizing, electoral campaigns, policy, and advocacy on racial, economic, social, and environmental justice issues. She began her work on social justice in earnest as a student at UC Davis, where she double majored in African American Studies and Sociology in organized student groups. I had the privilege of first meeting Ms. Agbo not long after that, at the beginning of her career when she was a community organizer in Oakland. She worked for 6 years at Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, where she held many roles, including policy director for the Green Collar Jobs campaign. She worked tirelessly on local and statewide ballot initiatives that promoted equity and justice toward California's hardest hit communities. It was during this time that she began to build a national reputation in attendance at the Congressional Black Caucus and at creative economic conferences covered by cable news networks. It was also during this time that Ms. Agbo earned a Master's of Public Administration, specializing in financial management from San Francisco State University, and her reputation and expertise has continued to grow. She worked as director of programs at Eco District, leading their Target Cities program, which was a program that, quote, supported 11 neighborhood-scale sustainable urban regeneration projects across North American committed to equitable economic development, end quote. She worked as director of programs at Transform Finance, where she trained social justice leaders on how to use investments to maximize transformative social change. As the principal of Nwamaka Agbo Consulting, she supports projects that build resilient, healthy, and self-determined communities rooted in shared prosperity. She's a senior fellow at the Movement Strategy Center and was a 2017 fellow at the Rudolph Steiner Foundation's Integrated Capital Fellowship Program. In addition to her consulting practice, Ms. Agbo currently serves as an advisory board member to Oakland Rising Action and a board member to Thousand Currents, Center for Third World Organizing, and the Schumacher Center for New Economics. In 2020, Nwamaka Agbo stepped into the role of inaugural CEO of the Katali Foundation, an organization that practices solidarity philanthropy in the areas of environmental justice, mindfulness, and healing justice in the Restorative Economies Fund. Nwamaka Agbo's career working to bring about eco-equity brings together economic, ecologic, and justice frameworks to imagine and, more importantly, to build more equitable worlds. She's not afraid of speaking directly and boldly on the most pressing issues of our times, as demonstrated in her recent article on Nonprofit Quarterly entitled Rejecting False Harmony. She is a woman about her work, and she does it with rigorous excellence and principled care. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome her to our Freedom School series tonight.
Thank you for the warm introduction, Dr. Bascom. You dug up some things in my history that I wasn't fully prepared for, but there you go, there you have it. It's an honor to be with all of you this evening and have an opportunity to share a little bit about my world lens and how I look at the state of the world, and why I created a framework called Restorative Economics to guide me both in my community organizing and consulting practice, and as the guiding framework for Katali's Restorative Economies Fund. In a moment, as I kind of set up this screen share, by way of introduction, I think, I'll start with this story to let you all know a little bit more about how I entered into the work of investments and economics through my background of community organizing, policy advocacy, and even electoral campaigns. To start off, I would say that there's a number of different stories that brought me here, but one in particular, 2008, the 2008 Great Recession started to hit 501c3 nonprofit organizations right around 2012. And this was because many foundations were only then experiencing the delayed or reduced returns to their endowments based on what had happened on the traditional capital markets because of the Great Recession. And so at this time, I was in a leadership position at the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. And spent a lot of meetings reflecting on how we were going to actually do the fundraising to not only meet our campaign deliverables and do our work that we had committed to do out in the community, but also how were we going to keep the organization afloat. And I share this story because as somebody who comes from a social, racial, and economic justice background, I then recognized that as we were pushing for economic justice policies, we as an organization weren't actually observing what was happening in the broader economic system, and therefore what the Great Recession would mean for our organization and so many others down the line. And this is important, particularly because so many of our social movements, those social movements that are the front lines of contesting for power for Black and Brown people, unfortunately rely on the 501c3 industry to fund their work. And what we know is that the 501c3 industry being designed to create charitable tax benefits isn't necessarily designed to create community wealth or shared prosperity. So that's when I really wanted to dig in to understand what was happening in the broader economy, not just in the field of philanthropy, but how could we actually start to engage with the broader economy? How can we start to really push the impact investing field to start to move capital in a way that actually supported people and the planet? And so to kick us off, I think I always invite people to sit with how can we start to rethink economy? I think the recent events of GameStop, as we've kind of watched what has happened on Wall Street, people have started to enter into a conversation about how the economy is made up. And I think the ways that the rules that we have created for how we move resources and capital between communities and around the world, those are rules that were man-made. And I think it's an important story to lift up because it reminds us that we can actually create new rules that are designed to benefit people and the planet. And so when I went back to graduate school, this was kind of the opening page in my macroeconomics textbook. And the opening section really introduced the study of economics to us as one in which we were studying who gets to decide who eats caviar and who eats potatoes, right? Who gets to decide who is taking the public transportation and who is driving a Corvette. And so if this is the world lens under which we're determining the redistribution of goods and services across communities, we will always create a system where we have haves and have-nots. And there's an opportunity for us to actually think about what is a different system? What is a food justice system where we're clear we don't actually want food deserts? We want all people to have access to safe and healthy food. We want all people to have access to quality, reliable transportation. And so the ways in which we frame how we're thinking of capital, how we're thinking about the distribution of goods and services frames then how we set the rules for how those things move across our communities. And so there's just some clear patterns around our economic system that I think are important to really sit with and lift up. We know that we have an economy that profits off of extraction of natural resources. We also know that we have an economy that profits off of exclusion, excluding certain people from being able to sit and participate in the benefits of what our economy has to offer. And those certain people oftentimes are Black and Brown impacted communities of color. And that our economic system drives us towards accumulation. It drives us towards hoarding resources at the expense of what others need. And this hoarding is what then allows us to actually have more control, more say, and ultimately more power over our larger economic systems. And so these patterns, extraction, exclusion, control, and accumulation, can be taken to look at any system, whether it's the food justice system, the education system, or even the housing system. You know, I'm based out of Oakland, California. We have a very intense real estate market. And one of the things that we know coming out of the subprime mortgage crisis was that extraction was actually what allowed a lot of people to benefit and profit off of the foreclosures. So while people were being pushed out of their homes, forced to live in their cars, there were others that were coming in and extracting that wealth and that benefit for themselves. And we also know that we have a history of exclusion where we're looking at housing policy, whether it's the history of redlining, whether it's looking at how projects have been developed and centered in urban communities. Those have all been designed to exclude Black people from being able to participate in the housing system. And we know that housing is ultimately one of the ways we're able to generate or create generational wealth, right? And so this exclusion from Black and Brown people from being able to participate in our housing rights system is then what allows individuals who have the liquidity to then accumulate more and more housing. And then this accumulation is what makes it possible for corporations who then benefit off of this extraction, exclusion, and accumulation to then have more control over our democratic system, which then determines what affordable housing looks like. And so we have seen corporations like Airbnb actually take out millions of dollars in a number of urban cities across the country to fight ballot initiatives that are designed to preserve access to quality housing for those communities that need it. And so, if we know that these are the patterns of how our economy works, we have an opportunity to create a worldview or world lens of economic patterns and systems that are actually designed to create justice and liberation for all people. And in order to do that, what we also need to do is understand that the paradigm, the way that we think about economy is one in which we're always thinking about the dollars and cents, right? And so, when I study economy, when I talk to other economists, the words are always about what is happening in quote unquote the market, right? The invisible hand of the market, or what is the GDP? We look at dollars and cents as a way of measuring the productivity of a particular economy. And what we also know is that the Greek meaning of the word economy is actually the management of home. And so when I'm thinking about my home, I'm not thinking about the dollars and cents while I am, yes, trying to pay the bills and take care of all the things that make it possible for me to be in my home. Ultimately, my home is where I think about my relationships, my culture, my tradition, my spiritual practices. And so, how do we also start to situate ourselves or situate our understanding of economy in one of which we are thinking about the management of our collective home together, and not privileging capital over the needs of those of us that are in this collective home being our planet Earth. And that so much of the ways we think about economic development is that oftentimes we have decision makers who are coming into communities, making development policies that then have a say, or that then directly impact that local community. But oftentimes these decision makers, these developers, investors, don't actually come from those communities. They don't reside in those communities. But the ways that they're moving capital, the ways that they are restructuring, redeveloping our landscape seeks to directly impact those who live there. And so the opportunity to really figure out how do we bring those that are most directly impacted into authority positions where they get to be the decision makers of their local economic development. And economic development, not just being the built environment, but also thinking about the businesses that we support, also thinking about the education systems, our use of public spaces, all those things that we know create a vibrant and thriving community. And so, as we think about what it takes from us to move from the patterns of extraction and accumulation and in towards economic systems that are really rooted in regeneration, governing for the common good, shared prosperity, and inclusion, the ability to actually identify solutions where these new patterns and practices intersect is where we get to really think about how can we restore our economy and therefore actually create more justice, equity, and liberation for all people. And so that's kind of the rationale, the thinking behind what brings me to my work on restorative economics. So restorative economics was a framework that I started to develop as I was working with a number of community-based organizations, being in social movements myself, and really recognizing that, while I was working on policy and really thinking that policy and engaging with government was the ways to actually shift economics in our local community, that behind the scenes we had lobbyists, we had special interests that had the dollars and cents, that had the resources to sway elected officials and actually change the political process. And so restorative economics is a way of thinking about how do we reinvest resources back into those communities that have been historically extracted from, excluded, hurt, and harmed, and put resources back into those communities in a way that it makes it possible not only for them to heal and be made whole, but also for them to be able to then engage in conversations about what it takes to actually create a more true, just economy going forward. I would say that the framework of restorative economics for me takes a very explicit race analysis because in the history of the United States and the global North, racism is what has perpetuated our system of capitalism. And so I don't actually think that we can have a conversation around our harmful economy without actually wrestling with the history of race and racism. And so I would lift this up because I think restorative economics sits in complement to other frameworks like the just transition framework that we see many social movements lifting up in the US global North, the solidarity economy framework that women of color in the global South have really lifted up, particularly around land reform efforts. And even then on the Eastern Seaboard, I guess we call it, the Eastern United States, new economy as a study that's actually come out of academia. And what has been important for me to understand in my work is that race needs to be a part of the conversation, because what I've observed is that as we've seen more funders and investors who want to actually move their money with impact, what ends up happening is that their money continues to move to those same people that have access to the leisure capital, the flexible time, and the risk tolerance to take on new, innovative, cooperative sharing models. But what ends up happening, those communities that have the leisure time, the flexible capital, and the financial risk tolerance are communities that are white and wealthier. And so in order to actually repair our economy, we have to be very intentional about who we reinvest in. So Black and Indigenous immigrant communities of color, how we reinvest in them, moving what's called non-extractive capital designed to leave more value in the community than we take out, designed to profit off of. And then what projects we support, projects that actually help us to start to move towards models of shared prosperity and community wealth building. Last piece I'll say, just by way of context of the wording of restorative economics, is that it's intentionally informed by the restorative justice as a strategy that many communities are using to heal and address conflict, with an explicit lens towards reparation. And so restorative justice takes us through a process of acknowledging the hurt and harm that has been done to a particular individual and or community, engaging in a process to figure out what reconciliation and restitution looks like, and then committing ourselves to actions of repair going forward. And I lift up those three stages because in order for us to actually get to a more true and just economy, once again, we first need to heal and make whole those communities that have been locked out and left behind so they can be a part of the conversation, creating a more just economy going forward. And so the theory of change that I work within is to support projects that are community stewarded. I'm interested in supporting projects where we see groups of organizations, groups of individuals coming together to collectively own and manage an asset together. I lift up ownership and I lift up asset because I do think it's important for us to be very explicit about who owns the asset, because who owns the asset is actually getting the financial return. Oftentimes in my experience with community organizing work, communities of color are taught to only look for the social benefits, only count the number of jobs being created, only count the acreage of green space that they may be getting. Meanwhile, what we see and what we know is that there are people who are financially benefiting off of these projects. And so this is what actually lends itself to the racial wealth gap, when we're actually not visibilizing who is generating the profits or how the profits are being generated and who is receiving them. And meanwhile, we tell the community to look at what the left hand is doing. Meanwhile, the right hand has something going on. The important the importance of us being able to be very clear that we need to own and manage assets together. And this is what allows us to start to move out of an economic model where we lift up the need to have financial benefit and returns for an individual and start to look towards what are the ways that we can hold assets in community together that's actually building shared prosperity. And that understanding, the other piece is recognizing not only how do we own this asset together, whether it may be a community center space or whether it may be a community governed loan fund, that we also need to wrestle with, well, how do we make decisions together? For those of us that have done organizing or have been in deep relationship and community, conflict is just a part of what it means to be human and be in relationship to people. And so we know that we need to actually have governance structures that allow us to navigate conflict, not from a punitive place, but from a generative place. And we know that we need to actually start to figure out, how do we create decision-making processes that allow us to really lift up in terms of volume on those voices that have been most silenced, so that they actually get to be a part of making the decisions for how this asset benefits all of us and not just some of us. And particularly when we see our democracy constantly under attack, and we see, as Nicole Hanna from the 1619 Project lifts up, that Black people have been the great perfecters of democracy, as we kind of seen in most recently the Georgia Senate elections. We have an opportunity to have these smaller projects in community where we're actually able to experiment with what true deep democracy looks like, rather than having to always confront voter suppression, Citizens United, and all the other ways we try to deny people access, not only to the vote, but making their voices heard and ensuring that their needs are able to get met. And so at the end of the day, while I think it's important for more people to own more things together in service of shared prosperity and self-determination, that the work of creating economic power is deeply linked to the need to create political and cultural power as well. So I always seek to support projects that, while they may be taking on an equitable economic development project, what is the ways that this project is then ensuring that the community is able to leverage this asset so that they can contest for power under a different terrain that they haven't had before. And so to just kind of move us through it and break down the pieces of the framework, once again, the first piece is really sitting with the need to acknowledge and repair the hurt and harm that has been done to communities by oppressive economic policies and practices. I think this is important because while so much of the ways we do our political organizing is about shifting structures and institutions and creating new cultural practices, we also recognize that as individuals and people in interpersonal relationships, we also need to start practicing these new elements of regeneration, governing for the whole, inclusion, in order to be able to shift these larger systems. And so how do we start to identify the choice points of when we're making decisions, be it which bank teller we may be, which bank we may go with, the terms under which we may accept a loan, which vendor we may hire for a particular business? How are we actually making very intentional choices about how we are using our own goods and resources in a way that starts to shift the system and shift the structural and cultural practices that we're all in, and recognizing that this is deeply embodied work as well. And so this is where we start to think about the cultural practices that we bring to bear that allow us to actually be in that embodiment of what we're trying to lift up. How are we actually starting to have new practices as a society, as a community that's actually committed towards more collaboration to be the thing that guides us and creates those moments of choice points for us to actually be in new values of how we engage with capital and money going forward. And once again, this work around deep democracy and governing for the whole. Angela Glover Blackwell is the founder of an organization called PolicyLink. And Angela Glover Blackwell tells a story about when the American Disabilities Act passed. One of the first things that happened is that in the built environment, cities started to actually cut the curbs out of the sidewalk. And so cutting out the curbs is what then allowed people in wheelchairs to be able to access the sidewalk. And what we know is, when we're walking down the street, is that those curb cuts are also what allow people or children who are riding their bikes, people who may be pushing strollers or carts, to also access the sidewalk as well. And so, how do we start to think about the ways that we are governing to be able to make decisions in a way that we're leaning towards this curb cut effect, if we would call it, right? The curb cut effect being, how do we identify who stands to be most impacted by this development project, who stands to be most impacted by this policy? And how do we center their needs, their interests, and their voices in when we make those decisions, and understand that when we do so, we then make it possible for their friends and family, their brother and sisters, their communities, their neighbors, and the broader region to also benefit, right? And so, particularly when we're looking at the systems of accessibility, of food justice, of education, of healthcare, all the systems that actually weave together to make up the fabric of our society, starting to actually center those most impacted to inform then how we move forward with making our decisions. And that we understand that when we bring together all elements of a community, even the most unlikely allies, and we come together and invite people to commit to collaborating on a project where we're then able to have everybody name and co-define what the actual problem is based on our vantage point, based on how we may come to a particular issue. We may all characterize a problem differently, but when we bring that information together, we can actually get at the root cause of what the problem is, and from there we can then design a process for what the solutions are and the actions are that allow us to actually transform and address the root causes. And so, leaning into practices of deep collaborative governance, while it may take more time and it may be more process intensive, is actually the thing that allows us to address the root causes of a problem rather than only kind of dealing with the superficial aspects and continuing to perpetuate hurt and harm on an ongoing basis. And that, once again, this work is ultimately about transforming power, right? Really ensuring that those impacted communities have the political power that they need to transform society. And so here we really understand that our cultural power are those norms and values that we lift up and celebrate, those norms and values that inform how we make decisions about redistributing resources across the community, right? And so when we lift up those norms and values and they inform then what the economic power is, who gets to benefit from the economic systems, we also come to understand that in time we see policies that are in place to also uphold those norms, those economic policies, and those practices. So our work is about as much as shifting and redistributing wealth as it is about ensuring that we're creating new values, new practices, and that we are also making sure that we are creating policies and getting political wins that allow us to then defend our wins and memorialize them so we don't have to continue to contest for power going forward. And that lastly, while this work is so much about how we move from extraction of natural resources and accumulation of wealth and start to move into a sphere of regeneration and redistribution of wealth land, that so much about this work is about power, right? Power being both who has the authority to make decisions and who has the resources to see those decisions implemented. And so, as we see social movements on the front lines contesting for power, the need to understand that calling for a defunding of the police is also about ensuring that we have the resources needed to then build the type of community and societies that we want to see going forward. And so, as I look to kind of in my role at Katali with the Restorative Economies Fund, as we look to resource projects that are, looking at land and housing stabilization initiatives, or really starting to create community governed loan funds, that the work that we also ask projects, how are you in direct relationship with the social movements that are on the front lines of fighting for justice that you are then benefiting from? How are you both in relationship to them in terms of solidarity, both socially, but also financially? and always really inviting the economic engines that are actually trying to create a more just and equitable economies going forward to recognize the role and responsibility to continue to stay engaged in the political and cultural fights as well. And so in order to really do this work, we need to actually invest in the human development capacity building of communities that have been locked out. When we look at the racial wealth divide, so much of the conversation is about white generational wealth in comparison to Black generational wealth. We continue to talk about the dollars and cents, which is important. And what we also know is situated within that gap of the racial wealth gap is the gap in knowledge, skills, capacity, and access to networks. And so in order to actually move capital and resources in a more regenerative way, we also have to ensure that these communities have access to the financial literacy, have access to the networks and resources to actually run the experiments that allow them to actually create a more regenerative economy going forward. So how do we resource the human development and the capacity building in addition to moving the capital to these projects and these communities that they need to then create a more just local economy? And that so much of this work, we have a habit, particularly in the US, because of white supremacy and because of capitalism, where we continue to want to create something new. And what we know is that so much of what we're trying to do is actually rooted in reclaiming the traditions and culture and wisdoms of the indigenous communities that we come from. And so I'm Nigerian, and West African communities have a practice of Sankofa, where we really lift up the need to go back and get it. And so how do we actually kind of bring that Sankofa value into the way that we do our work, where we actually get to reclaim so much of what is inherent to us to then inform and apply it in our current social, economic, and political context to then inform how we can create something that is more just and equitable going forward. And that in order to ultimately really robustly build out this work, we also need to create infrastructure. We need to engage in a community of practice where we're identifying the lawyers, the financial experts, the accountants, the architects, the developers that understand our vision and commitment to justice and equity, that are not just coming to tell us, no, we can't do that, but are willing to help us figure out, well, how can we do it? And how do we start to actually seed this infrastructure in a way that it's wholly owned, governed, and serving the Black communities that are building the new economy going forward? And so these essentially are a lot of words that just recapped what I shared. When I think for my work around restorative economics, I really lean into regenerative and non-extractive capital. And so this means actually providing the long-term patient capital, what's called the subordinated investments that allow communities to access capital, to then negotiate and access capital in traditional capital markets under more favorable terms. Because when we think about the racial wealth gap, that friends and family money that entrepreneurs often tap into from their local community, unfortunately, Black and Indigenous communities of color don't have access to that friends and capital money. So how can we engage with funders, donors, and impact investors to provide that early stage capital that then sets these communities up to negotiate more resources under better terms? Always figuring out then what are the community governance structures, right? What are the pathways in which we invite community members to come to the table and to be a part of the conversation and decision making process around some of these projects and what it therefore means for their community? And always being clear that this work needs to be rooted in a movement building strategy, right? Always really leaning towards the political, economic, and cultural power that's needed to protect, defend, and assert on that local community. And always kind of leaning into the values that line strategic partnerships and technical assistance providers that really support our communities and taking their work from vision to design to implementation. And so this is the work that I do as a guiding framework, being able to support projects that are community owned and community governed, and projects that are really clear about their role and responsibility in staying in the political, cultural, and economic fight for liberation and justice. And so I will stop screen share. And I think we can move to Q&A. Oh, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Agbo, for that informative presentation. Thank you to Dr. Bascom for inviting you and recommending you for this series. If you have any questions, please place them in the Q&A section on the Zoom conference call. And to kind of start us off, I do have a question. So you were discussing restorative economics and applying it to looking at nonprofits and working with community organizations. So what does restorative economics look like as applied to nonprofits? So if we were to take a movement or a social movement, how would that actually look on the ground?
Sure, that's a great question, Lakita. So one of the first projects I consulted on was a project actually by the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights in partnership with Restaurant Opportunity Centers United. So these are two movement-based building organizations that use a 501c3. And what they did is they came together in partnership, created a joint LLC, what then allowed them to purchase a building together for a community center space. So now we have movement-based organizations that have acquired a building that's then able to provide affordable below market rate rent to other nonprofit-based building organizations in the Oakland area that, in a time of COVID, in a time of rapid gentrification, ensuring that our communities have spaces that they can go to for organizing, spaces that they can be in for training, and an asset that's actually held jointly in community is what it would look like in practice. And I would say the mechanics of what it means for movement building organizations to actually go through the steps of raising funds, acquiring a building, negotiating an acquisition loan, securing new market tax credits, redeveloping the space, engaging with the city for permitting, then allows us to understand that when we are pushing for equitable economic development policies, what it takes to get there, what the barriers are that actually prevent our local leaders from passing policies to redevelop communities or redevelop our neighborhoods in a way that actually serve the needs and interests of our communities, are all lessons learned that we can kind of then take towards our ongoing political organizing work. And so Restore Oakland, the website is restore.oakland.org, is one of many examples that I would say really lift up and highlight what the regenerative economics and just transition work is starting to look like across the country.
Thank you. Can you give us that website again so I can make sure we put it in chat?
Yes, it's Restore, Restore, Oakland, OAKLAND.org.
Thank you. All right. Another question for you. Can you say more about how community structure and global relationships factor into community stewardship and policy and infrastructure building?
Ooh, that's all the things in there together.
Yes.
I'll do my best. I think part of the work is understanding that while we want to contest for power on a local and national stage with local governments, we also want to position ourselves to be the ones that are actively building the types of neighborhoods and communities we want to see. And I think this is extremely important because while we're clear that unfortunately elected officials can be compromised and don't always represent our interests, that's why it's even more important for us to be the ones who, since we hold the values, to really place ourselves in the positions and commit ourselves to the discipline of understanding what is needed to really redevelop communities in a way that speaks to our values as social movements, and recognizing that while we may have projects like Restore Oakland on the West Coast, and we also have the amazing work of Anasa Troutman with Historic Claiborne Temple in Memphis, and we have the work of Push Buffalo up in Buffalo, New York, that while these projects are very local, the opportunity for them to be in direct conversation with each other through a translocal movement of what are we learning about what it actually takes to rethink our economy and to renegotiate capital and move it in different ways. And so I think that's how we start to understand these very local rooted, these local projects that are rooted in local social movements, how they can be in relationship to one another, and also understanding that, as the Ella Baker Center and Restaurant Opportunity Centers United are doing their work with Restore Oakland, and ANASA is leading the reconstruction of historic Claiborne Temple, that they need access to capital campaign directors, people who know how to fundraise multi-million dollars to make these projects possible. They need access to the legal professionals that are going to help them understand how to structure multi-stakeholder owned projects. They need all the things. And so that's where the infrastructure piece comes in terms of what is the scaffolding that we start to invest in as a people to then ensure we're able to have a number of these projects taking place across the country.
Thank you. A big part of our conversation currently, and you mentioned it, is this movement to discuss defunding the police or returning power to the police. How do you have any idea of how this could be done, of how we could think about those various structures that you have identified and making sure that we have access, but are taking the funding to lead to a more just society? And so using restorative economics in that basis.
Yeah, I think the point of connectivity in terms of the national movement to defund the police, and actually I would say a global movement around state-sanctioned violence, is the connection is, particularly in the US, a majority of metropolitan city budgets, 50% plus, goes towards the police. And so when we see so much of our tax dollars going towards a system that we know ultimately does not keep us safe, those are resources that are not going towards feeding our young people. Those are resources that are not going towards providing access to affordable quality housing, education, all the things. And so how do we actually think about this call and this work around defunding the police as an opportunity for actual justice reinvestment, reinvesting in the things that we know do actually keep us safe? Mental health services, being able to support the creation of freedom schools, and all of those systems, all of those things that we know we need spaces to actually make them possible. They need entrepreneurs, facilitators, leaders, resource to actually lead those programs. And so restorative economics comes into play in terms of how do we take the money that ultimately is used to police and incarcerate Black people, and instead use it to invest in the community leaders, the programs and services that actually help to keep us safe. And that's how we can kind of think about the opportunity for restorative economics to enter into the conversation around defunding the police.
Thank you. And as a follow-up to that, you mentioned that previously you were working in policy and you saw that as a way to change. You thought that was a way to change issues within our communities. And now you're saying a combination of working with 501(c) and nonprofit organizations. Do you still think that it's necessary to work in conjunction with policy or policymakers in order to make this change, or should it be type of a grassroots from the bottom up type of strategy?
That's a really good question. I think the truth is we need it all, right? We need to work at the grass tops when it comes to policy, because we know policy is being made every day that directly impacts our day-to-day work. And we know that we also need to support those that are on the grassroots, that are being innovative and creative outside of the systems that we know also don't serve us. And so I think the opportunity here is for, whether it's direct community organizing, whether it's policy, whether it's electoral campaigns, for people to really figure out what are their greatest gifts, and how do they bring those gifts to be of service to the larger Black liberation work, and understanding that I think it's a disservice for us to say that there's only one right way to get free, and it actually behooves us to understand when we bring together all of our skills and talents, that is actually how we have a more comprehensive solution towards serving a holistic community. And so I think all of it is necessary. I think that there's still a role for 501c3s. I think that there's still a role for policy work. And unfortunately, our fight for freedom means that we have to kind of, pat our, what is it called? Rub your belly and pat your head at the same time. We gotta, chew gum and walk at the same time.
Thank you. Okay, another question is, you mentioned in your slides that it's a necessity to provide resources to individuals in order to learn how to cultivate their own communities, right? And so you were saying that they need skills and resources in order to build their communities. What are some ways in which we can provide those resources? And so I think what they were talking about is the point in your slide when you were talking about training individuals and giving them
The capacity building, human development work.
skills.
Yeah, I think that there's a number of ways that we can start to be more creative about how we support the leadership development of individuals. I think one of the things that we are looking at with the Katali Foundation is how do we actually support our grantees to be in direct conversation with one another? So being in peer-to-peer learning conversations. So when I look at the work of Jessica Norwood in creating Runway, and how she is working to provide friends and family capital to Black entrepreneurs. I think Jessica has so much to share and teach, and also learn from projects like Boston Ujima, that's also created a community governed loan fund and has figured out how to move capital in their community alongside the social movement work. And so there's the opportunity to figure out how do we mobilize and support community members and leaders to be a part of social movements where they get to be in direct conversation with their neighbors and learn from each other? I think there's always the need for fellowships. And so how do we also support those organizations that have the capacity to bring people in as fellows so they can learn alongside the campaigning strategy, the policy work that so many organizations are moving, particularly on the national front. And we also just need to create opportunities for people to come together and reimagine. I think that there's both a need to learn just kind of the mechanics of economy and how it works in capital. And I also think it's important for people to have the opportunity to dream and imagine, and then start to pencil out how they would make those dreams real. And so how to also resource individuals through the 501c3 structure so that they can learn and have an opportunity to actually implement that work going forward. There's a number of different ways, whether it's through schooling, whether it's through training programs, or getting involved with local movement building organizations where people can start to tap into how to learn these skills. I think it's tricky in a time of COVID when those of us that have the privilege to are sheltering in place. And there's groups like People's Hub. I would say People's Hub, and a dear friend who passed last year, Alondra Williams, committed herself to creating a platform to ensure that trainings are accessible to people online, particularly from a disability accessibility justice lens. And so organizations like People's Hub, I think, are a great resource to go to learn more. I would also say groups like the Sustainable Economies Law Center, based out of Oakland, California, has a number of videos on their website about their work where they're sharing learnings with each other. And I'll rattle my head to think about some more and drop them in the chat box as well.
Thank you. I know recently there have been a lot of conversations around food insecurities. And so there are different organizations who have been developing strategies such as food co-ops and other things similar to co-ops, where they are actually taking the resources and the skills and the people from their community to provide to others in their community. Would this be an example of what you have been describing today on a small level?
No, I would say on a big level, right? If we feed our people, right, then their bellies are full and they're able to fight. Yes, I think this is a big part of the work, being able to have access to our food systems. And so I think about organizations like the National Black Food and Justice Alliance, led by individuals like Dara Cooper, who are brilliant, who are really bringing together Black food justice organizers and food providers to think about what it looks like for us to have more control and say over our food systems. And one of the projects that I've been honored to support with the Alliance is the work of Black Land and Power, an initiative to create a financial commons where we as Black people can create a land commons that we're then able to use the land both as a productive resource for providing food, but also as safe and sacred spaces to gather. I think of the work of Leah Penniman up in New England area, bringing together young farmers of color that are wanting to get back to the land and wanting to really figure out once again, how do we make more just and equitable food systems. Even the work of Savvy Horn with land loss protection and how she has worked to really protect Black farmers that continue to be under threat for having their land extracted from them. And so yes, I would say the cooperative food movement, both from a land and food justice perspective, but then also from a cooperative grocery store perspective. Erin Dale, based out of Durham, has been working to create a fertile ground food co-op. In West Oakland, California, we have the Mandela Food Cooperative, where worker owners came together and created a grocery store that major grocery store chains told them, you're not worthy of investing in. And they're like, well, we want to eat too. And so this community came together and created a worker-owned cooperative grocery store. So yes, I would say that co-ops, particularly food co-ops, definitely kind of fall into this vision of what a regenerative economy can look like going forward.
So with that, there is a lot of hesitation because we are in a capitalist society and people are still looking at, as you stated, the dollars and cents of things. So how do we push this message forward? How do we change the language around community ownership and get more people to think about restorative economics and implement that in their strategies?
Yeah, this is a good question. I remember a couple of years ago, I had the pleasure of being in Haiti with the movement Peasants of Papai. And I remember one of the movement leaders told me that my responsibility was to both speak out against capitalism while understanding that I sit in the contradiction of being in the eye of the storm of where capitalism is derived from in the US. And so all this to say, our ability to hold an awareness around navigating the contradictions of capitalism while also having to live in it is part of what we just have to stretch ourselves to hold. That being said, I think the opportunity to really show and lift up there are models and there are ways of doing this work where we don't have to extract and hurt communities for the financial benefit of an individual. I think about the work of the Mondragon Cooperative in the Northern Basque region of Spain. This is an entire cooperative community. From their university system to their restaurants, to their grocery stores, through their banking systems, all of it, all elements of their local economy are designed as cooperatives and have been functioning as cooperatives for decades. And so we see this work happen at scale, and we see it happen successfully. So there's both models for us to look towards. We also know as Black people, we have a history of cooperative economics. Ella Josephine Baker, cooperatives were part of what she loved to really lift up and celebrate. So it's also in our DNA. And so the ability to actually challenge ourselves to really question when and how we can own things together in community. How do we need to kind of change and shift our understandings about what it means to create community wealth and shared prosperity, and then do the hard work of figuring out how we structure it, whether it's a joint LLC, whether it's a cooperative, whether it's some other creative mechanisms for how we structure community ownership but we already have models and legal entities that we can move towards. And from there, when we are organized, as I opened with GameStop, as GameStop has showed us, as the uprisings that we all witnessed this past summer has shown us, when we are organized, we can contest and negotiate for capital under better terms. And if we find those early funders, donors, and investors that will provide us that early seed capital to really build out our business model, to do the market study, that then gives us better footing to then negotiate the terms under which we may receive capital